This is my Lian Li A4H2O PC. Hi, my name is Jelvin, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how I transfer the parts from my NR200P MAX PC to the A4H2O. This isn't really a build guide, but if we have similar parts, then I hope this video will help you with your own build. Starting with disassembly, I took the parts out from my NR200P MAX PC that I built back in January 2022. If you want to see how I built this PC, you can check out the cards in the top right corner. After taking the parts out from my Max PC, I went ahead and unboxed the A4H2O. It actually took me a while to get the H2O, but I managed to cop one at a lower price. Here's a quick comparison of both cases. The H2O isn't that much smaller than the Max case, but I just happen to like the H2O a little bit better on the looks department. The NR200P MAX is an awesome case though, so I'll definitely reuse that in a future build. Focusing on the H2O, I remove all of the detachable parts starting with the 4 thumb screws at the back, then the cover panels, the power supply shroud, then the bottom cover, the accessories packet, then 2 expansion slot covers from the back, and lastly the top radiator mount. There are a few things that I needed to work with internally, and these are the power cable extension, the front panel power connector, the HD audio, the USB 3 connector, and the USB-C connector. Let's not forget the PCIe Gen 4 riser cable. Now that I've detached everything from the case, let's talk about the parts that went into it. Feel free to skip this section if you want to go straight to the reassembly, but if you want to know the components that I placed inside the H2O, here is the parts list. For my processor, what I have here is the i5-12600K. For my motherboard, it's the Asus ROG Strix Z690i gaming Wi-Fi. As for my RAM, it's a pair of 16GB DDR5 5200MHz sticks. I actually bought this pair of sticks along with the Gigabyte Z690i Aorus Ultra, but even after my motherboard swap, I decided to keep the sticks since the PC was running well despite it not being in the QVL. Moving on to storage, what I have are the Western Digital SN850 1TB as my boot drive, another SN550 500GB as a backup drive, and one of the 2 1TB Western Digital Blue 2.5-inch SSDs. I'll also be using a straight SATA cable instead of the angled ones. You'll see why later in the video. These are just some of the old parts that I'll be reusing. If you want to check out the motherboard swap that I mentioned, feel free to check the video in the top right corner. So on to newer parts. For my graphics card, I got the Asus RTX 3070 Ti Tough Edition. I didn't really want to go all out with more powerful hardware since newer ones are coming out really soon, so this is enough to satisfy my preferences for now. For my cooling solution, I bought the Fantex Glacier 1 240MP. Unfortunately, the one that I got did not come with the LGA 1700 bracket, so I had to request one from Fantex. Luckily, the bracket came in a week after my request, so huge shout out to Fantex for actually sending it in real quick. The pump already had some thermal paste applied to it, but I cleaned it up anyway since I wanted to use my thermal grizzly tubes. I then attached the mounting screws to the motherboard. I actually kept the included MP fans and instead attached two Noctua NFA 12x25s. I'm also going to be reusing my Fantex 4-pin fan splitter to power up the fans. I then mounted the radiator bracket using the screws included in the case. I made sure that it wasn't that tight so that I can work on the clearance a little bit easier. I just wanted to mention that I attached the bracket in the inward orientation so that there won't be any problems closing the case. For my power supply, I chose the Corsair SF750 80 Plus Platinum. So the main reason why I got this power supply is because of the individually braided cables. It actually made cable management a little bit easier. Attaching the power supply to the shroud was pretty straightforward. You just have to use the right screws and making sure that the fan is pointed outwards. Last but not least, I attached one of my 2.5-inch drives to the bottom cover where the sockets are pointing outward. There are 4 included flathead screws specifically for the SSD. You won't miss it. That's pretty much it for the parts. Next is placing everything in the H2O. So the steps I'll be sharing here may differ from how you're going to build your PC, but feel free to follow along. Even before putting the parts inside, I did some cable management in between attaching parts. What you're seeing here is me routing the cables within the case while anticipating where it'll be plugged in. For the HD audio, I routed it behind the bottom beam since the connection to the motherboard is on the lower left side. For the front panel connector, USB 3 and USB-C connector, I routed the cable along the center. And to retain the bends of the cables, I temporarily used some reusable zip ties. For the power cable extension, I bent the cable so it'll look a little bit cleaner. Here are how the cables look like after some finagling. Next, I focused on the motherboard, but before placing it to the case, I routed the fan splitter to the cavity at the upper back of the case. The idea here is to route the fan splitter by the heatsink so the cables won't need to go under the fans. Before screwing in the motherboard to the case, I connected the fan splitter to the CPU fan header along with the EPS cable to the 8-pin power connector. After screwing in the motherboard, I attached the HD audio connector to its header on the lower part of the motherboard. For the Z690i Strix, I can actually connect the front panel power connector to the header on the daughter board. But since there's a dedicated power header on the motherboard itself, I connected it there instead. I then connected the USB-C and USB 3.0 connector to its respective headers. I also plugged in the daughter board back since I'll be attaching an SSD. This step might differ from yours, but if you have the same motherboard as me, feel free to leave the daughter board out if you're not using any other front panel connectors or SSDs. For additional cable management, I used some Velcro strips to tie the cables together. I prefer using Velcro strips over traditional zip ties since I can reuse them if I decide to reroute things later on. I also tied the EPS cable with Velcro strips to act as trainers for the cable. I then attached the 24-pin cable to the motherboard and also tied it with Velcro strips. For the AIO, I first attached the 4-pin cables to the fan connectors on both fans before inserting the pump to the case. I also tied the fan cables with some Velcro strips so that it's easier to handle. Then I connected the fan cables to the splitter before placing the radiator at the top of the case. After making sure the clearances are good, I fully screwed in the radiator to the bracket. I actually forgot to connect the riser cable to the PCIe slot, so I did that afterwards. Next was applying the thermal paste. I made sure the surfaces are clean on both on the IHS and on the pump block before applying the thermal paste. Let me know in the comment section if I put too few or too much. After applying the thermal paste, I decided to attach the pump block with the pipes coming out from the left. I then routed the pump connector around the pump and between the heatsink and RAM before connecting it to the AIO header on the motherboard. After attaching the AIO connectors, I then screwed in the radiator bracket to the case. Attaching the power supply was pretty straightforward, but I had to remove the shroud twice because I forgot to plug in the power extension cable. Once the power supply was attached, I connected all of the necessary cables that I needed to the power supply. Since I mentioned that I'll be attaching an SSD at the bottom of the case, I also attached the SATA cable connector along with the SATA power connector to the PSU. Laying the case to its side, I plugged in the 3070 Ti in this manner. I also locked the socket and screwed the graphics card to hold it in place. I then attached the two PCIe power cables to the graphics card. Still at the bottom of the case, all I needed to do was to make sure that the connection to the SSD is on the right orientation, which should look something like this. Then I just plugged in the cables and screwed in the back cover. I decided to keep the infinity mirror in the build, so I had to use the proprietary LED cable that came with the AIO and route it to the 3-pin RGB header. I actually spent another hour of cable management off camera, but after that, all I needed to do was to close it all off. The whole build took me around 2 hours, give or take, but if I wasn't shooting the whole thing, it'll probably take me just half an hour to finish everything. And the end result kind of looks something like this. I've actually been using the PC for about 2 weeks since the time of recording, and things actually have been pretty good so far. I'm actually really satisfied with this build, and I'll probably be using this PC for a while. And that's the end of the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a question or a note in the comment section below. If ever there is one, see you on the next build.